Get ready for your next true crime binge.
It's all a blur. My Aunt Ilsa called me and she just said, get to the hospital. The doctor came in and told us that there's really not much more that they could do for her and that we need to go say goodbye.
This doesn't happen to people like me. A new true crime 10-part series from the makers of Sword and Scale launches March 3rd. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 263 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Channon Stewart, Miffy Doodlebug, Olivia Wiklowski, Daniel Krasansky, and Morgan Dotson. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Sleep. Sleep was released in 2023. It has 7.1 out of 10 on IMDb and 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. Sleep follows newlyweds Hyun Soo and Soo Jin, whose domestic bliss is disrupted when Hyun Soo begins speaking in his sleep, ominously stating, "Someone's inside." From that night on, whenever he falls asleep, Hyun Soo transforms into someone else, with no recollection of what happened the night before. Overwhelmed with anxiety that he may hurt himself or their young family, Soo Jin can barely sleep because of this irrational fear. Despite treatment, Hyun Soo's sleepwalking only intensifies, and Soo Jin begins to feel that her unborn child may be in danger. I would like to point out that I really don't think that her fear is irrational. Okay, so in that synopsis, it says that her fear that he might hurt himself or somebody else is irrational. It is not irrational. It's not remotely irrational, okay? Let's not bandy the word irrational around willy-nilly when it is not appropriate. So let's do likes first for this film. I saw the trailer for this. I think I was in the cinema when I saw the trailer for it. I never got to go and actually physically see it in the cinema. And I was immediately interested as someone who has frequent sleep issues. I thought, yeah, this looks like a great film. Is it a horror film? Is it a psychological thriller? I didn't know. I would say it's a horror film, right? And to be honest, I've thought a lot about what I really liked about this film. And I realised that what I really liked was their relationship. It's really unusual in films like this to see a couple, I think, that are so deeply connected and so together. And look, they're not perfect. They really struggle. And there's a weariness and they grow tired of each other. But they are resolved in figuring this shit out together. Right, they are fully together. They are dedicated to each other. And I was emotionally invested in this couple, right? I thought they were sweet. I thought they were like nice to each other. They obviously were struggling hugely with his sleep disorder, but they really were deeply likable. And while that sounds really stupid, I do think it is a major problem in horror films. Like often when horror films are essentially a two-hander, like this film is a two-hander. You have these two characters. You have some other kind of characters that dip in and out, but for the most part you're looking at this couple, and often horror writers don't write the couples well, so you're not emotionally invested, and frankly I end up being like, oh my god, put them in a rocket and blast them off into space for all I care, because I don't care about what happens to them. And you know what, I thought this was a really clever idea for a horror film. Watching him go to sleep every night and wondering what the heck he was going to do in his sleep was really a stroke of genius, because it's simple, right? It's a simple concept, and it doesn't really matter, I think, who you are or how good your relationship is or how together you are. Sleep is the thing that you have to do alone. Like, you can't sleep together in that sense. She can't control or she can't change his behavior in his sleep. And that is really scary. Like, that's a really scary thought. And I read a review that said the reason this film was so effective is because you never felt safe. And I thought, oh, that is exactly what it is. No matter what was going on, and, you know, weird things happen in this film, you don't know if those weird things have actually happened or if those weird things are imagined. And you're looking at kind of imagined horrors and you're thinking, I don't know if this is imagined or not, because this man could do these things in his sleep. And the writing and the direction makes it really clear what is happening in reality and what is not happening in reality. But in those moments, you don't know, because you're thinking, Jesus, this man is pretty much capable of anything. And that doesn't make him an unlikable character, which is really interesting. You could easily be like, what a terrible, awful man. But you can't, because the setup allows you to see that he is asleep when he does these things. And he has no control over the things that he is doing in his sleep. And I also think it's important to kind of point out that this film is actually really funny. Like, there's great comedy moments in their relationship. There is obviously a lot of darkness, but the brevity comes from within the silliness of their relationship. And it's kind of sweet to watch. There's also great moments, you know, a shaman comes in order to kind of figure out what it is that's causing this sleep disorder, when they're trying to find any reason as to why this sleep disorder is happening, and they bring in a shaman or a shaman. I don't know what the correct way to say it is. And it is a welcome break from all the tension, and it's funny. Like, there is definite humor there, and there were moments in it where I was really like enjoying the comedy that the director found within this really quite harrowing story. And now in terms of dislikes, right, I am going to tell you that there's a supernatural element to this story. So, you know, don't think that this is just about a fella who has a sleep disorder. No. There's supernatural stuff going on too. It is a slow burn, okay? So if a slow burn isn't really your vibe, then maybe I'd still recommend checking this film out. You might be pleasantly surprised. But it doesn't have like jump scare horror vibes. And the supernatural element is incredibly subtle. I will also say that please do a Does the Dog Die search if you are sensitive to anything about animals. Okay? A Does the Dog Die search is great for any film. If you are a new listener and you're like, what the heck does she mean by Does the Dog Die? Does the Dog Die is a website where you can search up triggers in various films. Those triggers can be anything, but it also can be just fundamentally animals dying in films, right? So Does the Dog Die is a great resource if you've got a really specific trigger that you find really difficult in films. I think the thing that let this film down for me is the supernatural elements, right? Because I just didn't feel like they were fleshed out enough. There was a real ambiguity about what the heck was going on for this couple. For both of them, there was a real ambiguity. You were kind of like, God, is this in his head? Like, is this pathological, psychological, medical? Is it supernatural? Is he possessed? Like, what is going on? But I did feel like the supernatural elements weren't fleshed out enough. And therefore, it took away from the ending for me. I kind of wanted to see things that truly felt paranormal and unexplainable in order to really wrestle with myself about what I thought the ending meant, right? I don't want to give away the ending, so that's why I'm being a bit ambiguous myself. And for once, I will say that I thought this could have been longer. This film is pretty short. It's like an hour and a half long. And I kind of thought, oh, give us more time. Let this supernatural element, let this South Korean folklore about death and about, you know, how many days your ghost has to leave Earth before it gets stuck there. Like, flesh that out for me. I want to know more about that. And I think if that had been more fleshed out, the ending would have packed a much more emotional punch. Because I actually thought the ending was quite understated and beautiful, but it just didn't have the kind of head scratching oomph that I wanted, because it lacked the depth of those supernatural elements. But the bottom line is, I didn't think this film was perfect, but I did think it was a really bloody good idea. And I mean, we've all experienced when you don't have a good night's sleep, right? And you just cannot function properly the next day. And for some people, sleepwalking, night terrors, you know, all those things are a part of their life. And I think those things are really scary. I think the fact that you could wake up in the morning and somebody could be like, did you know that last night you did all of these awful things? And somebody could go, what? I was dreaming that I was, I don't know, running from a T-Rex. What do you mean? Anyway, I'm going to give Sleep 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was a great concept. Needed to flesh out the supernatural bits more. But in terms of characters and story, I thought it was original and nuanced and interesting.
On average, you'll have to wait 31 days to see an OBGYN. And if you're dealing with an infection or outbreak, you know you need care fast. That's where Wisp comes in. Connect with a U.S. licensed provider online and pick up safe, effective treatment at your local pharmacy that same day. Plus, get birth control and more delivered in all 50 states. Take control with comprehensive sexual and reproductive care, all from your phone. Wisp. That's HelloWisp.com. The waiting room can wait.
Worried about what ingredients are hiding in your groceries? Let us take the guesswork out. We're Thrive Market, the online grocery store with the highest quality standards in the industry. We restrict 1,000 plus ingredients, so you can trust that you'll only find the best high-quality, organic, and sustainable brands, all free of the junk. With savings up to 30% off and fast carbon-neutral shipping, you get top trusted groceries at your door, and you can stop worrying about what your kids get their hands on. Start shopping at thrivemarket.com/podcast for 30% off your first order and a free gift.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Thumbtack presents the ins and outs of caring for your home. Out. Indecision. Overthinking. Second-guessing every choice you make. In. Plans and guides that make it easy to get home projects done. Out. Beige on beige on beige. In. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to hire. Start caring for your home with confidence. Download Thumbtack today.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story this week is not about sleep and the terrible things that can happen when you are asleep, but it is a story that is requested by somebody. If you are the person that requested this story, hello. Thank you for requesting this story. I'm sorry it took me so long to get around to it. And our story this week is slightly shorter than normal, but we're just going to dive headlong into it. And I must also apologise because Hades has decided that now is the time to run around after his toys, to use his scratch and post aggressively, to insist upon jumping on my lap, rubbing his head on the microphone, etc. So if you hear any of those things, I apologise. He has no manners. So let's get into the story. It may be hard to imagine today, but there was a point in time when any new settlement in North America was a frontier of some description. If not placed precariously on a brutally cold and inhospitable stretch of land, every log cabin, every cluster of houses that became a village was still a desperate attempt to settle in the vast wilderness and roaming landscape that the people who came before us found themselves trying to survive in. Pennsylvania was once like that too, and nestled within those state lines still lies one particularly unassuming rural community. Today, Spring Mills has a population of around 424 members. And I know, that may not sound like much at first, but it's a dramatic increase from the 268 members it had in 2010. When you keep the number of people living there today in mind, and you imagine a small town buried deep in rustic countryside and winding sleepy lanes, it somehow becomes a little bit easier to imagine what life must have been like there before, when the village was newly founded. Back then, during the 1800s, The number of people living there couldn't have been that drastically different to the numbers that we see today. Many of those first settlers would have been German immigrants, coming to America to try their luck working the land and forging a future for themselves. They were poor but resourceful, puritanical and brave. These kinds of people didn't need for much, and whatever they did need, they were used to making it themselves anyway. But the same couldn't be said about the community of Spring Mills when it came to faith. Religion can be a tricky thing, and faith too. Often someone can have faith or share the same religion with someone else, but it doesn't mean that they're able to spread the teachings or lead others in traditions of their faith by themselves. That was a hard truth that the community of Spring Mills found out as they struck out into the wilderness alone. But with that realization also came a solution. The problem that the people of Spring Mills faced in 1775 was the same one that many other communities all across America did as well. In fact, many people from many different backgrounds and many different faiths were on the lookout for a new source of spiritual enlightenment in this new land. And in many of these pockets of communities, there wasn't even a church to go to find it. Answering the call were the travelling ministers. They would spend their time moving around a circuit of villages and communities, spreading the word and helping the faithful worship out of the comfort of their own homes. The one who would come to Spring Mills was Reverend Philip Fithian, and his circuit would take 6 weeks to complete. He travelled up and down the Penns Valley, staying in the homes of the faithful and holding ceremonies in their front rooms for anyone to attend. It helped instill in these small clusters of humanity a building need for religion and a sense that there was something out there that was bigger than themselves. And then, in 1796, Jacob Albright founded the sweeping evangelical movement. His beliefs burst onto the scene, offering a new take on piety and a return to the humble puritanical ways of worshipping. By 1806, he had established a solid number of staunch believers, one of them being a man named John Doberman. John and his wife lived on Egg Hill, which just so happened to be in Spring Mills, giving the newly elected bishop a foothold in the small Pennsylvanian county. And whenever Jacob would stay with the Dobermans while out on his circuit, there would be a new face or two staring back at him in the Dobermans' front room. Slowly and over time, the people of Spring Mills began to follow Jacob Albright and his evangelical teachings, and by the 1830s, that number had grown too large to fit inside the Doberman household any longer. For a while they managed by dividing the faithful into different homes, but that only meant that the visiting minister would have to perform the same service 4 or 5 times on the same day. The community gathered together once more and put the issue up for debate, and it was settled. What the community of Spring Mills needed, first and foremost, was a church, so that they could congregate and worship together. One where the minister could come and lead his flock, not multiple times, but once on a Sunday. They got to work. The Dobermans donated some of their land on Egg Hill, and by 1838, the people had come together to craft a log church, not too unlike the log cabins that still littered the frontiers and pushed the edges of civilization out further into the wilderness. That log church would stand for about 30 years, serving the community of Spring Mills and witnessing weddings, baptisms and funerals. And when that log church was past its heyday, the people of Spring Mills were only more devout in their faith. On the same site, they rebuilt their church, not out of logs this time, but out of stone and timber. Following their evangelical beliefs, the new church was plain and simple. It was supposed to be humble and subdued. The worship of God, after all, was the most important part of it all, not the pomp and ceremony or the flashy extravagance that other churches had seemingly fallen victim to. There was no stained glass windows, no golden altars, no cushioned pews, only pine and stone and a steeple that, unfortunately, hasn't survived to today. That was the church that the people of Spring Mills built, and that is the one that still stands tribute to them today. complete with a cemetery around the side. The cemetery, just like the church, doesn't see much use today, but the oldest graves lie in the back, where many of the dead buried there lost their lives during the Revolutionary War. Between then and now, the church on Egg Hill continued with its weekly services until 1927. The number of congregants never quite recovered after the First World War, and as it stands today, the number of faithful evangelical followers within the community aren't enough to keep the doors open full time. Once a year, on the last Sunday in September, the church springs to life once again to hold its annual homecoming service before slipping back into hibernation. And when you hear that, it could be quite difficult to imagine what the church must have looked like at its peak, when the people shuffled in once a week full of expectations and ready to hear the word of God. It could be easy, especially given the church's stark and almost foreboding exterior, to imagine that the building had always been empty, always been cold and asleep, and yet it hasn't. In fact, there are a few stories about the church at Egg Hill that could have you believing that the hairs along your arms aren't simply standing on end because of the cold. The main story about Egg Hill constantly shifts. It is hard to pin it down exactly like smoke, or sometimes which direction the wind is coming from. But always, at the very core of the legend is death, and lots of it. Supposedly, the church on Egg Hill was the site of a mass murder. Whose murder and when is ever changing, but you know the saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. And when there's multiple versions of the same story, well, some of it has to be true, right? One version goes that the minister, right at the turn of the 1800s, became disillusioned with his flock. Maybe he had grown tired of trying to educate lowly farmers. Maybe he'd wanted to move on and land himself a bigger, better church in a more highly populated area. Maybe he was just stark raving mad. As the congregants filed in for their weekly service one ordinary Sunday morning, this devious minister executed his diabolical plot. Into the wine, he dropped a vile concoction of poisons, and down the faithful fell. He buried their remains in unmarked graves in the nearby woods before vanishing without a trace. Another version of this story has this vicious minister coming not after the entire congregation, but for the most vulnerable members of the community. Now transformed into a wicked man, the minister supposedly targeted children. In this version of events, he didn't murder them all in one go with poisoned wine, but with cunning and despicable intelligence. At first, no one thought much of it. During those times, children dying was unfortunately a common thing. There was disease, there was famine, there were accidents and infections and fevers. It was all too easy. Wherever the minister went, children seemed to die shortly after. Sometimes he killed them out in the open, sometimes they drowned in the river or got trapped under a weighted wagon, sometimes they convulsed and burned like they'd been struck down by a terrible sickness or had even been possessed by a demon. It was all very believable at first. But then the people of Spring Mills began to put two and two together. When the minister realised that his goose was cooked and the people were after him, he hanged himself inside his own church to avoid their ire. If this version of events is true, or either of them I suppose, then the people of Spring Mills who fell victim to a devilish minister never received justice. Either they were all slain by the man that they held in the highest regard, and more than likely trusted even more than they trusted themselves, or they lost their children to him, one at a time and painfully, over and over again, like picking at a scab and never letting it heal. Is it any wonder then that some of them would still linger in the fold trying to find retribution? Some visitors to Egg Hill report coming face to face with some of the minister's victims. Or perhaps face to face is a bit of a stretch, as witnesses claim to see shapeless apparitions and shadows coming from the cemetery and the woods. Are these the spirits of the people buried out amongst the trees in unmarked graves? Are they some of the children who fell victim to a murder that was believed at first to be an accident? Some people say that these spirits will follow you all the way back to your car and run alongside it for a while after, dark and shapeless and clearly after something. Some people say that they've heard the bell ringing in the steeple that isn't there anymore. It's the bell that would have rung to call the faithful to service. Perhaps even the last service that any of them would ever attend alive. With its stark pine walls and the emptiness both inside and around, it's not hard to feel like you're being watched by something. Anything, really. Or maybe it's just that the walls themselves have borne witness to a tragedy they wish would go acknowledged. Visitors report hearing strange noises like thumping and footsteps coming from inside the church during the night, even though the church is closed and not open to the public for most of the year. And at night, those shadows that chase people to their cars also seem to grow stronger and start to speak, although witnesses can't quite make out what they're saying. As far as physical evidence goes to back up these tragic stories, however, there is unfortunately not much to go by. There are no records of any mass deaths at the turn of the century, no mass grave out in the woods has ever been discovered, and there doesn't seem to be a spike in the death rate of children during the time it's believed this murderous minister would have been active. According to Dick Decker, Potter Township chairman, the ghost stories about the church are the result of someone's imagination and not founded in fact. He went on to say, "During my 70 plus years, I've always considered the Egg Hill Church and its location as a very peaceful place that exemplifies the strong Christian values held by our forefathers when the area was first developed. It exists little changed, except for the weathering and natural deterioration from the time when it provided a centre for community worship and fellowship in days when the pace was slower. It provides a solitude difficult to find in our busy society today." That is, however, apart from the one day a year that the church on Egg Hill relives its former glory, if still in the more humble and subdued fashion it was founded in. With no pomp and no circumstance, the members of Spring Mills community file in to sit on wooden pews and witness their annual homecoming service, just like it would have been centuries ago. Churchgoers sing their hymns without an organ or an instrument of any kind apart from their own voices. They'll listen to the youth choir perform their own set of hymns. And of course, they'll listen to the sermon, usually provided by a minister, either retired or borrowed from one of the other more populated churches closer to more dense civilization. In his own circuit, if you like, one that maybe takes 1 year to complete rather than 6 weeks. A beginning and an end that all comes back to being a pocket of humanity placed right on the edge of a barely tamed wilderness. Like I said, kids, it's a short one today all about Egg Hill Church. And it was requested by somebody. I don't know who that somebody is, but hello, if you're listening. Very little information about the actual hauntings. Egg Hill Church seems to be one of those places where people go, oh my God, that's the most haunted church in America. You know, you get those kind of stories, and then you dig down into it and you're like, oh, there's very little in terms of witness testimony about this church. And listen, it goes without saying that the people who settled in America did not discover that land. Native people, indigenous people had been there living happily and comfortably on the land all over the Americas for a very long time. Okay, goes without saying, we are just acknowledging that, and we are saying yes, we are aware of it. I do think, when I think about people who went out to America and were building their log cabins in the middle of nowhere out in the wilderness, trying to create, you know, civilizations and villages and towns and whatever. I just, it is absolutely bananas to me that first of all, these people, they're coming from Germany. There was lots of Irish people, lots of English people. We know all the stories about all the people that travelled across from Europe to America. Imagine the boat journey, first of all. And then you arrive and you're like, great, we've got to build these log cabins now in this really inhospitable environment that's actually quite difficult to live in. And we're going to have to be really resourceful to be able to do it. And actually, it's going to be really difficult. And so this is our lives now, and it's tricky. For those average day-to-day people, God, life must have been pretty grim and pretty difficult, to be honest. And when I was reading this, I was thinking about the film The Wind. If you haven't seen that film, I've definitely reviewed it before. It is worth a watch. And also the film The Witch. Equally, The Witch is a brilliant film. We love it. But it's kind of about these people living in these communities and how just scary life was. Life was difficult, and not only are you up against the weather and the elements and trying to, grow your own food, forage for food, all of those things and create a life, you're also up against worries about the supernatural, worries about the devil, worries about living a good Christian life. I mean, God, you cannot keep all that stuff in your brain. And if you haven't seen the film The Wind, like I said, I highly recommend it. Essentially, it's a woman who is out on the frontier with her husband and he has to go and do something, and she's left alone in the house, and she becomes terrified that there is something outside the cabin that is trying to get her. It's good film. And what's really interesting about this is we know that religion was a huge part of life and still is a huge part of life for a lot of people. I'm not a religious person. I don't pray to any particular deity. I don't prescribe to any rituals of Catholicism anymore or any of that stuff. But it was incredibly important for keeping communities together. And it was also seen as incredibly important for giving people a sense of belonging and a sense of what was right and wrong. And there were places in the world like these frontiers where villages and towns were being set up where they didn't have a police force. They didn't have people to enforce a law. So religion was a good way to keep people on the straight and narrow, because we don't have police officers. But if you do horrible things, do you know what's going to happen? You're going to go to hell and God's going to be really angry. So I find it really interesting that in the middle of all of this, in this tiny, tiny place, this story has emerged. This story has grown up about this minister who killed all of his parishioners, poisoned them in some sort of Jonestown-esque situation where he poisoned the wine. If anybody in this moment is thinking of the song City Hall by Tenacious D, you are not alone in those thoughts. Thank you. And look, if this had actually happened, if this minister had murdered a load of his parishioners by poisoning them all with wine, or equally started murdering children randomly, there would be evidence, there would be documentation, there would be a mass grave or whatever it was. But it's interesting that this story even exists. And I would potentially question and consider whether this story had happened elsewhere. Like, are there other stories in America of ministers poisoning their flock? And I can't really find any stories as such where I think, oh, that's where this came from. There are a few stories of ministers and reverends behaving badly. In 1832, there was a minister called Reverend Avery who was accused of murder. He was accused of murdering a young mill worker in Rhode Island, and she was strangled, and it was believed that she was pregnant, and he was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. And despite his acquittal, apparently, public opinion remained strongly against him and he had to leave the area. And in 1859, there was a Reverend Henry Budge who was accused of poisoning his wife with arsenic, and it was a huge murder trial, but he was acquitted due to lack of definitive proof. And then there was Reverend John S. Glendy in the 1790s, who was a Presbyterian minister originally from Ireland, and there was all these allegations that he was like violent and threatened dissenters, but he didn't seem to like poison or kill anybody. I just wonder if there's like an amalgamation of stories going on here about Egg Hill Church. And what is even more interesting to me is the fact that there is a graveyard. There are people who died probably before their time of disease and accidents and plagues and fevers and the Revolutionary War. Like all of that happened, and there are bodies buried there that have, that were probably died before their time. So it would make sense if people were saying, these are bodies from the cemetery, or these are ghosts from the cemetery that are haunting people. But no, we're going for a minister murdered everybody, and that's where all the ghosts come from. And as far as ghosts go, they don't sound great, do they? They don't sound very nice. They don't sound very sort of blink and you'll miss it, especially when they are running after your car. That feels new. We've had lots of shadow people before, so we're seeing shapeless apparitions, and they're coming from the cemetery and coming from the woods, emerging from the woods and running after your car. We're not having that. Get a life. Pardon the pun. Grow up. Don't be running after my car. And I mean, church bells, that feels like residual energy. I would get on board with that. I'd be like, yeah, sure, I believe that happens, even if the steeple isn't there anymore. That makes sense to me in a stone tape theory kind of way, that is just like an echo in time that people are hearing. And I'm just going to say it, right? If I was Dick Decker, Potter Township chairman, I'd be going, yeah, Egg Hill Church, mad haunted. Crazy haunted. I feel like an episode of Ghost Adventures would be good here, because not that we just want loads of tourism in the area, not that we want that. Just really think it's super haunted. Although in small places, that are little villages, they're often not equipped to handle lots of tourism. So maybe that's a terrible idea. This is why I'm not in charge of a township anywhere, okay? Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, even though it was short and sweet. It's one that's been on my list for a while, so I wanted to get it done. I wanted to cross it off the list, and here we are. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you have a story that you would like to send in, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com, and if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Worried about what ingredients are hiding in your groceries? Let us take the guesswork out. We're Thrive Market, the online grocery store with the highest quality standards in the industry. We restrict 1,000 plus ingredients, so you can trust that you'll only find the best high quality, organic, and sustainable brands, all free of the junk. With savings up to 30% off and fast carbon neutral shipping, you get top trusted groceries at your door, and you can stop worrying about what your kids get their hands on. Start shopping at thrivemarket.com/podcast for 30% off your first order and a free gift.